Hey everyone, good evening tonight. My name is Mike Stevens. I am one of the MST tutors. I've been with MST for, hard to believe, over 3 years now. I'm a PGY3 dermatology resident, and I'm thrilled to have you join me tonight as we have a conversation about, as we kick off our IMG Summit and start off by talking about the changes that are happening to Step 1. We'll dive into it a little bit more, but if you haven't heard, it's moving to a pass-fail scoring system in the near future. And of course, that comes with a lot of implications for planning your exam, when to take it, how to take it, and what that means for your residency application. And my goal is tonight to kind of dive into all of these questions and any other ones that you guys have that come up along the way or that you might already have. Just to take a step back and give you guys a little bit of a snapshot of med school tutors in general and who we are. We're a one-on-one online tutoring company that really works with every aspect of training from even before medical school in the pre-med process and applying to medical school. Every step of the process through the board exam, Step 1, Step 2, and of course, Step 3 after medical school. Applications to residency, navigating all of the nuances of ERAS, your interview process, making your rank list, and then even beyond that into board exams for different specialties and certifying exams. We have a long track record of success, over 15 years. And at the core, really, who we identify as is a group of people that have gone through this process, have along the way kind of figured out how to navigate it, and want to be able to pay that forward to people who are going through it now, people like you, and help you achieve that same level of success. As I mentioned before, we're kicking off our IMG Summit, and kind of another nuance of that, and me personally, is we often have a lot of experience working with people who are IMGs and applying as such. I've had many students over the years who have had a lot of success on their board exams and ultimately with their residency applications. And so, I think it's a unique aspect of our organization that we're pretty uniquely suited to be able to meet all of the needs that might be unique to your specific scenario. And then just to give you guys a little bit of an outline of again, what we're going to run through tonight. As I mentioned before, we're going to kind of dive into the changes that are coming to Step 1, and with a special emphasis on what that means for residency applications. And then, of course, one of the biggest highlights is going to be, you're in a little bit of a unique scenario with the changes that are coming. And with that gives you options about when you should take Step 1, how you should do so, and really the metrics that you should be using to try to figure out what's the best plan forward based on the information that you have available to you, and kind of optimizing your success with these changes that are coming. We'll also dive into a little bit what this means for other board exams, Step 2 and lesser Step 3, and what the implications that has for when you take Step 2 and how you take Step 2. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. And so many of you have already sent in questions, and we'll be sure to cover all of those tonight. Again, if any come up along the way or that you think of now, you can either drop them in the chat now or save them for the end, but I'll do my best at the conclusion to kind of run through all of those. So just to dive right into it then. So what's the news? What's changing? And of course, then it's that starting in January of 2022, so about 6 months from now, they're going to transition from the numeric 3-digit score that everyone knows for Step 1 to purely a pass-fail system. And it's not retroactive, so anyone who has a 3-digit score will keep that 3-digit score. It'll still get reported in all of your transcripts. And everyone who takes the exam all the way up until that date will still have a 3-digit score reported out. The only difference then, of course, is that if you take it after that date, then you'll have a pass-fail score. You won't be told whether it won't be a 3-digit number. It'll just purely be either pass or fail. If you pass the exam, then you'll be done. It's a one-time kind of test. In the scenario that we want to avoid and make sure doesn't happen, but in the scenario where someone were to fail the exam, that would get reported. Ultimately, then going on to pass the exam then would also get reported. You have to pass the exam before you can proceed. But just note that you have to make sure you pass it on the first try, because a failed exam would still get reported to the residency programs in your ERAS application. And so I think just to give a little bit of the context behind why all of this is happening is there's been a lot of debate over the years about what step one should represent and how it's come to occupy the space that it does. And the reality is that it's meant to be a basic science competency exam. Do you know the language to be able to start delivering patient care? And over the years, it's kind of been adopted into residency applications as a kind of performance metric, a number that you can almost use as the standardized exam to put everyone on a quote unquote level playing field and be able to have a value that you can use to kind of compare one applicant to another. And on some level, that really wasn't what it was intended for. And the change that happened was intended to try to dial that back, or at least realign the purpose of step one with its original mission of being a basic competency exam, as opposed to this kind of end-all be-all test that really has such implications and significance for your residency application. And so, of course, the timing of the change I already mentioned is coming at the beginning of next year, so January 2022. And then I think extrapolating that out, kind of playing it forward and seeing what the effect of that would be is, of course, if you're applying for residency this year, you'll have a step one score on your application. And it really won't have much of an effect. It'll just be kind of business as usual. All the applicants are going to have a 3-digit score on their application. And we're going to have another application cycle, much like the previous ones. I think where the nuance starts to come in is if you're applying in 2022 or if you're applying in 2023. And what you can expect then is in 2022, of course, you'll have a mix of students with and without numeric scores. And I think that's where the nuance will be. It'll be a little bit challenging to interpret all of this. And that's what we're going to kind of dive into when we talk about when to take the exam and whether you want to be one of those students who's applying with a numeric score or without a numeric score. The further out we get from this change, the more into 2022 and 2000 and beyond that we go, you'll have more and more people who are going to be reporting scores after the change and will only be pass-fail. And then, as I mentioned before, you really want to prioritize making sure you pass on the first attempt. In any of these scenarios, if again, in the scenario that we want to avoid where you fail the exam, that would get reported on the application in the same way that it would now. And so no matter what, you have to make sure that you're comfortably within passing range and making sure that you're in a place to feel confident that that will be the reality by the time you take the test. And so the changes, the effect of that change as across the board, as it relates to other board exams, is now we really don't have step one as this again, quote unquote, level playing field. And in the absence of that, there's still the struggle amongst residency programs to be able to identify good candidates for their program and who they want to bring into their residency. And they can try to use other metrics. And so that's what you have to kind of consider in all of this is how will those other metrics either support your application or maybe not. One way that I think you can anticipate things kind of evolving is that step 2 CK will start to take on more significance. It's still going to be reported out as a 3-digit score. There's no plan to change that exam. And so prior to all of this, I would say multiple years ago, step 2 CK was maybe a little bit of an afterthought. It would often be reported out on people's applications, but it wouldn't be a significant component of the exam and of your application. But I think that now there's going to be a motivation to take it sooner so that you're able to report a 3-digit score of step 2 CK on your application in the absence of having a step 1 score. And then of course you should know that step 2 is a different exam from step 1. It's going to have more emphasis on clinical skills and clinical knowledge, less of an emphasis on things like basic science and pathology. And so, I think the most profound effect of all of this is going to be what it does for step 2. And so then this begs the question, when should you take step 1? Do you want to aim for having a 3-digit score, or do you want to aim to have a pass-fail score? And the truth is that it really depends. I can't give you a simple answer one way or the other about, yes, you have to do it this way, or no, you shouldn't do it that way. The kind of questions that you have to ask yourself to figure this out. Are you on a certain timeline? Do you have to take the exam by a certain date? If you do, then your answer is kind of already there. If you have to take the test by, as an arbitrary number, September 30th, then you're going to be within the cohort that has a 3-digit score. Another thing to consider with respect to the timeline is when are you planning to apply for residency? So if you're aiming to apply for residency in 2021, then you're going to be taking step 1, not pass fail. If you're going to be applying to residency well into the future, 2, 3, 4 years from now, then you're more likely you're going to have a pass fail score. I think the scenario where it's going to be unique, and you really have to think about this question, is are you applying for residency in 2022? And if that's the case, then I think you need to consider some other aspects that we're going to go into next. What specialty are you interested in? So if you are looking at some of the more competitive specialties historically, some of the surgical subspecialties, and certain other non-surgical subspecialties, you may know that they tend to have a little bit of a higher average step 1 score. And you may have some motivation to be able to match what you're seeing, what your peers might be sending in. In other words, if consistently people are sending in scores that are, 1, 2 standard deviations above the mean, it almost is to your advantage to want to be able to do the same and send in that, so that you can, again, be on a level playing field with them and take that metric out of the equation in terms of the evaluation of your application. You demonstrate, yes, I know what I'm doing. Yes, I can do well on step 1. That's not going to be a factor that would hold me back in any way. Would only being able to post a passing score affect you? Probably not, but it would be easier for residency applications to look at someone who scored 2 standard deviations above the mean and have a step 1 score that reflects that, and take that into consideration more than just seeing a pass. You may very well have been able to do as well as your peer, but the score won't be able to communicate that. So if you are posting those scores, if you are doing that well on your practice tests, it is to your advantage, especially if you're applying into a more competitive specialty, to go ahead and take the exam now and try to have a score. In terms of and I think the next 2 points kind of fold into that same argument: the application materials and your practice exam performance. If you are doing well and you are consistently doing well and scoring near where you want to, then go ahead and aim to take the exam when you still can, to have that score presented in your materials. On the flip side of that, if you're taking NBMEs, if you're doing UWorld self-assessments, and the number is lower than you want it to be, and you're a little bit on a timeline, you're feeling like you're plateauing a little bit, there's a lot of nuances to all of it, you're not seeing the results that you want. Number 1, I would always encourage, you can always reach out to us on that front. We're always happy to help talk through and troubleshoot and figure out what's going on. Number 2, though, if that's the case, then you can, and you have the bandwidth, you have the wherewithal to be able to wait until after January, it might be to your advantage. Because again, if you're kind of in a cohort with people who are scoring well above the mean, and you might be scoring at or below the mean, then taking that out of the equation, that aspect, and only showing a passing score might be to your advantage. So that's kind of how to think about the timing of when to take step 1. Let's take a step back and just broadly talk about how to prepare for step 1 as it relates to all of this. And so at the end of the day, even with it being pass-fail, you're still going to want to use the same tried and true methods. And again, I want to reemphasize, just because there isn't a score that's presented, I don't want you to diminish the importance of this test. It is critical that you pass the exam. And so what I have always recommended to my students, including all of the IMG students that I've worked with, is focusing on first aid and UWorld. These are really the 2 central primary resources that I incorporate into every student study plan. And what I like to do is really the front and center in the study plans that I develop is going to be the UWorld. And trying to get through the quantity of UWorld. It's really expanded over the years, but it's really the central resource to be able to do well. And supplementing that with first aid. First aid is a great textbook that gives you a snapshot of really the scope of what you should expect to know for the test. There's so much out there when it relates to this. The basic science is never ending. You can get into minutia of anatomy, biochemistry, genetics, immunology, and it can be very overwhelming. And the beauty of first aid is that it really helps encapsulate These are the things that, granted, it may not be everything you need to know, but these are the things that are likely to show up on your exam and that you should know. After that, there are other things that you can also look into beyond these two central resources. I see these as kind of tertiary options or supplemental options. They're not things that I'm having people spend more than an hour or 2 hours, really not much more than 2 hours, maybe 3 hours in rare scenarios, only because I don't want it to detract from these primary resources. And what I really see them as supplements to flesh out concepts you don't feel as comfortable with. People, I always use the example, when I was a medical student, I really struggled with antiarrhythmics. I just couldn't get it together. And trying to learn that for the first time through questions or through first aid might be challenging. And that might be a great opportunity to take a moment, maybe look at a Boards and Beyond video, look at a Sketchy Farm video, find some resource that explains it a little bit more thoroughly so you can get a better sense of what you need to know. And then what that looks like in terms of the timeline then is really, what I often advocate is going by organ system and spending a few days at a time on each of them with an intent to make as many passes as you can through when you first start your dedicated study period through to when you take the test. And then the one other thing I want to emphasize in this slide is the NBME exams and the UWorld self-assessments, which are of course not presented. So I think one of the questions that came up in the chat is, what is the pass-fail range to expect for step one? And it's the same as what you deal with now in terms of the 3-digit scores. And so what you're going to want to aim for is really hitting that 194 threshold. And what I often suggest is having multiple practice tests over 200. If you always are going to have a little bit of a variability in terms of your performance on a practice test. But if you're consistently posting scores that are over 200, you can walk into exam day feeling confident that you've got it. And so I often say 3 tests over 200 is really my minimum threshold to go ahead and proceed to take the test. In a perfect world, you'd be looking at multiple tests over 210, ideally, to really have that layer of confidence. You just have such a delta over the passing range that you can feel pretty good. There's no such thing as a crystal ball, and no practice test is perfect or practice tests. And so I can't necessarily guarantee that my method is foolproof, but in all of the years I've been doing this, that's kind of been the metric that I push people with. And once we hit those thresholds, then test day turns out okay. So that's how to think about when to take step one and how to take step one. And so let's switch gears then to step 2 CK. And in terms of when to take it, I wish I had, again, a very clear answer to tell you one way or the other. And again, it depends. And the truth is now, I think that we're really going to hit a point where step 2 CK is going to take on the function that step 1 did. And to some extent, a little unfortunately, the purpose of making step 1 pass fail was to take out the anxiety that now fuels it, the end all be all component of it, and make it a pass fail exam to pull all of this out of the equation. And I think what will ultimately, my suspicion, and granted, it's just my opinion, but my suspicion is that the buck will get passed down the road and step 2 CK will start to take on that function. Again, step 2 is more of a clinical exam as opposed to a basic science one. And the things to think about in terms of when to take it is, how far removed are you from your rotations? Did you have shelf exams in your rotations? Did they go well? Were there things that you learned from them about how to approach this stuff? Do you think you maybe need to review some more of those concepts again? Were there some that you maybe would have liked to have done better on and need to go back to that content? And sometimes people may be on different trajectories and they haven't finished all of their core rotations yet. And so you may want to consider, prior to all of this, you might have felt confident to just go ahead and proceed into step 2, even if you hadn't done, neurology, psychiatry, OBGYN. But now with the dynamics kind of shifting, you may want to have solid footing that you're standing on and feel comfortable with these specialties that you might not have done rotations in yet, and wait until after you've mastered them before you proceed. And then also you have to think about the ERAS application. So this is another question that's kind of as old as time is, do I take step 2 when I'm going to be, do I want my step 2 score on my application or not? And again, it was a very personal decision. And now I think the movement is going to be a lot towards trying to get that step 2 score on your application, just so that you're able to present to, especially if you're taking step 1 after 2022 and taking it pass fail. You want to have at least a number on your application. If you're only presenting a passing score, it'll be really hard for residency committees to stratify where you stand, especially if you're applying with peers who have multiple scores, have a step 1 score, have a step 2 score, because they will, the reviewers of these applications will have the safety in the number. They'll know, yes, this is a very clinically competent person. Let's take that very seriously. And it would be much harder to take away that idea if all you're presenting is a pass score from step 1. And then of course you have the same kind of metrics as before. What is your timeline? What specialty are you applying into? How have your practice tests been going? Do you need to push the test back? How does that fit into when you're going to be sending everything in? And the one last thing I'm going to say is just how it relates to how the application works. Historically, and things are always in flux now because of the dynamics around the pandemic, but historically when applications were due on September 15th, when ERAS first opened for submission, you would be able to upload your transcript, and your transcript is always available to the admissions committees. So even if you take step 2 months after you initially submit your application, your score will be sitting there once it's released. The question is, will the residency committee look at it? Because oftentimes they're so inundated with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of, that might be a little extreme, but even thousands of applications, that it would be challenging for them to constantly be going back and downloading data from the USMLEs website, from their interface that allows them to see how people performed on step 1 and step 2. And so what they often do is they will print out your application really in one fell swoop, and not often look back. Not as a blanket statement. There are programs that certainly do, but I'm saying all of this to state that when you are going to apply, you want to apply with everything that you intend to, just to make sure they're going to see it. Because if you do it in chunks, there's a very real chance that step 2 score that's going to come out later will never get seen by the application committee, because they'll never look for it, unless you try to prompt them to say, hey, here's my unofficial transcript for my step 2 score. It's also available online, or if you in other ways try to have pre-interview communication. And then just to give you guys a little bit of an idea, I think one question that came up in the chat already is about step 2 CK becoming difficult over the past year. And the truth is that I think that it's very hard to extrapolate how the level of difficulty of any of these exams. And the truth is they're all graded on a curve. And so the difficulty of the exam kind of comes out in the wash, because if an exam might be difficult for you, it would be difficult for other people. And then it kind of gets normalized relative to a mean, with so many standard deviations above the mean representing X 3-digit score. And so in terms of how to approach preparing for step 2, the main resources that you're going to want to use, again, UWorld is front and center. It has to be, it's crucial, really a central aspect of how you prepare for step 2. It's an excellent resource. I will say AMBOSS has really found its footing, is becoming an excellent resource, almost on par with the UWorld in my book. They have a great library of content. They have a great question bank that they've been refining. So I think AMBOSS is another great option that's really expanded this out. But you're going to find those two things are the two central question banks, and questions are going to be a central focus of your preparation for step 2. And then another resource that's really great is Online MedEd. It's a series of videos that kind of dive into some content. I think this is another example where it's great to focus your time if you have a specific subject area where you're having more difficulty. For example, if you're not comfortable with management on the labor and delivery unit and how to approach obstetrics, then I would recommend deep diving into the videos on that to try to get at least a basic idea of how to approach it. You don't have to watch all of the OBGYN lectures if you feel okay with abnormal uterine bleeding or management of oncologic problems. But again, another option that you can use. There's no great textbook, to be completely forward, for step 2. And we have some listed here. I see these as really supplemental. If you find that you're consistently getting UWorld questions wrong on obstetrics, then you might want to spend a little bit of time looking into a resource that gives you the background for just that area of obstetrics that you want to focus on, and not necessarily all of OBGYN, because you just don't have the time to read these textbooks cover to cover, nor would it really help you. It's not a very efficient way to prepare for this test. And so again, focus on the questions, a little bit of online method as needed, and then really the supplemental resources very much so as needed. And then I really want to emphasize this slide here. Medicine, medicine, medicine is a huge component of step 2. And so you have to feel very comfortable. And that comes through in the question bank. Over half of the questions, as you would expect, are internal medicine. And so you have to feel that cardiology, pulmonology, GI, renal, hematology, oncology, rheum, derm, all of it. You need to feel comfortable with it. I would even go so far as to argue a lot of the surgery questions are more the medical management of preoperative and postoperative patients. And so again, it all kind of falls back to internal medicine. You're going to catch a recurring theme here. It's a big chunk of this test. Of course, you're going to have vignettes that deal with children and being able to manage the specific conditions to them. They always, pediatricians always say, they're not just little adults. They have unique physiology. They have unique pathophysiology. And then, of course, OBGYN and psychiatry will be on there as well. And you can see there's a little bit of a spread in terms of how frequently each of these are tested. But again, I want to emphasize that you have to have a good grounding in internal medicine. And so with that, I think just to summarize all of this, all of y'all are in like a very unique situation with the changes that are happening to step 1. You're in control. You have options, and it's a good thing. I don't think you should have anxiety over this. I don't think you should stress. It's a special time where you are in control of what gets reported to residency committees. And the truth is, you have to just it's just more it's introspection about when you want to take the test. It's a very personal kind of decision. And then I think the point before, step 2, is going to be important and will continue to be, has become increasingly important, and I think will become even more so with the changes that are happening. And then when to take the exam is going to be dependent on your scenario, whether you have a step 1 score or not, how your shelf exams have been, how your practice tests are going, and what your overall timeline is for the application. And so with that, we'll just I just want to take one more quick second and give you guys another kind of snapshot of med school tutors and who we are. Again, one-on-one tutoring, and just to give you an idea of kind of the ins and outs of what that looks like. I think one of the most unique aspects of this is just having someone along the journey with you, and not even during the sessions, but even between the sessions. And so I make study schedules for all of my students. We kind of talk through at each of the sessions, okay, here's how things have been going. I like the questions. I don't like the questions. I like this resource over that resource. And then we develop a plan accordingly. The plan itself is very adaptive. Our sessions are very adaptive. We run through content. We run through questions together. We talk about here's how to answer questions. Here's how to think about this, how to think about antiarrhythmics, how to think about obstetrics. And really just having someone in your corner along the way. It's a daunting process from start to finish. And I openly recognize that I went through it. I know what you guys are in the midst of, and there's not many people who can do what you're doing. So you should definitely take pride in the success that you have and the success that you will have. But just having someone who's been through it and knows knows what they're doing it can be very helpful. Beyond that, we have planning sessions that can give you kind of a snapshot of an idea of in a shorter span of time, here's how to think about it, much like this, but on a more personal level. And then, as you're applying for residency, we have, me included, many tutors who are used to the process and can help you with crafting your personal statement, navigating the interview process, creating your rank list, all of the ins and outs. And with that, I hope this was helpful in terms of thinking through, at least understanding the changes that are coming and then thinking through how they will affect the residency application process. And And so to address some of the questions that are coming in, and feel free, if you have any questions at this point forward, we're now going to enter the Q&A portion. So do let me know. I'm going to pull up here the chat and a couple of things that have come through. So do you think shelf exam scores and medical school grades will be more important for residency apps? Very much so, yes. Very, very much so, yes. The challenge I think that will be inherent in that is that it's difficult to you can use med school grades to help stratify people who went to the same medical school, but you can't really use those numbers it's not that level playing field to compare an applicant from one school to an applicant from another school, because you just don't know whether the grading is equivalent in terms of grade inflation and things like that. And so I do think you should, in any scenario, you should always strive to do the very best that you possibly can. But I do think that grades will are important and will continue to be important. Another good question that came in is, would you recommend AMBOSS for step 1? Great question. So yes. The truth is that there are so many UWorld questions, and you have first aid on the side, that sometimes it can be hard, depending on your timeline, to carve out the time for AMBOSS. But if you have the bandwidth, you have the ability to switch gears to a second QBank, I think it's worthwhile. UWorld should come first in any scenario. So if you're running out of time, or you only have enough time to pick one, you should do the UWorld. But if you finish that off and you still have a substantial amount of dedicated time left, I'd go ahead and switch gears to the AMBOSS. Good question. Okay, the exact date for the shift to pass. Yes, so the question about, so if you go back to that press release where they discussed the change, and you can find it through a quick Google search. The specification is that it will happen no earlier than January 1st, 2022. So based on that language, now the USMLE is not, a disclaimer that the kind of conversations that they have about all of the ways that this is going to work out are internal to the USMLE. But my expectation is that if they're going to say that these changes are slated to happen no earlier than January, I think that's their language to kind of imply that that's the plan. Again, I can't guarantee that. They've left the door open for potentially doing it later, but they will. My expectation is that they will set something concrete in writing, kind of set it in stone, once they have a definitive plan of when the shift is going to happen, which my expectation will still be January 2022, though they may prove me wrong. So regarding shelf scores are the actual reporting of shelf scores are often not a component of most people's applications. It may be dependent on your school whether or not they decide to include that data point, but oftentimes shelf scores are not a component of people's applications, and so you shouldn't feel compelled to try to, at least from the you shouldn't feel compelled to feel like you have to include them in your materials, insofar as most people won't, and so it's not going to hurt you if you don't have them. And it would be hard for them to interpret it if you did include it, because again, it's not a very commonly used metric. And to that, and then they might see it and not really know what to do with that data if you're giving them shelf scores. So you should still do your best on shelves, no matter what, but I don't think it's going to be a big component of how they evaluate your application. And then, I think the question about how to make your application stand out otherwise, if you're taking it past, I think relates to what we talked about before. It's going to be the same kind of things with med school grades, having extracurriculars, research, I think will be very important. Really all of the same metrics that are currently used, or letters of recommendation, your work experience, your personal statement. I mean, all of these components are still going to be there in your app. It's just going to be that you won't have a 3-digit score. So in the absence of that, focusing on step 2 and making sure that you do well on that test, and rounding out every other aspect of what you submit is going to be the best way forward. So in terms of the 2023 match, 2 years from now, expectation. So I would say that there are a lot of US medical schools that will have people taking step one this summer or have already taken it this summer. And then those people, after finishing their second year, will be applying in 2023 as, so the question is, so in 2023, as there'll be fourth year medical students who would have taken step two now when it was a 3-digit score. But I don't think that's going to be across the board. And the reality is, I think a lot of medical schools will leave the door open for certain students to take it pass fail, to delay their exam into clerkship year. It's something that I've found very commonly in many of the tutoring interactions that I've had with students. And many schools actually do step one after their clerkship year, or on a timeline where you would be taking it after 2022 with an intent to apply in 2023. So I do think that it will be a solid mix of people who will have 3-digit scores and pass-fail scores in the 2023 match. And in that scenario, I do still think that step 2 CK would be important. As we move forward, of course, into the even beyond in the 2024 match and et cetera, I think the needle will shift even more towards most people will be pass-fail. But there will be a phasing in of this over time. I think you're going to have a lot of people who are 3-digit scores over the next, obviously in 2021, it will be all that way. Next year, it will be a minority that way. 2023, 2024, I think you're going to see mostly at that point moving towards the pass-fail realm. And then one question came in. Clinical grades are, yes. So as it relates to clinical grades and basic science grades, which are more important, as a blanket statement, clinical grades are going to be emphasized more so. I will never say do not do your best in what you're going to be doing with your medical education, but the clinical grades are where you really need to prioritize. Basic science grades, you should do your best. You should do well on those tests. You should post good numbers, but the clinical grades you really want to work hard. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending. If there's anything that that came up tonight that you want to discuss further, or anything that didn't come up tonight that you're interested in, you should feel free to send us an email at any point, hq@medschooltutors.com. Our phone number is below, as well as our website. And feel free to get in touch with us at any point. We are happy to help out in any way we can. Thank you again for coming tonight. It was wonderful being able to share the evening with you all. I want to wish you all the best of luck going forward with the rest of your training, and hope to be in touch with you all. Have a good evening.